Thank you very much, Rick. Great to see everyone here today in the same building that everyone came to in 1973. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you who are familiar with Canberra, particularly in the early 1990s, will recall this splendid building on the edge of Lake Burley Griffin on Ngunnawal country, with its prominent branding and flying the United Nations flag. Here we are. In 1994, David Brown, who's a criminologist, observed about the Institute's building, and he wrote, "For visitors to Canberra, the words criminology ringing the outside of what looks like a hotel by the lake invoke a sense of surreal. One wonders if this is Christo, the famous artist that draped buildings. Is this Christo at work? And sociology, anthropology and quantum physics and so on will suddenly appear writ large on other lakeside buildings." We haven't seen this yet, but you never know what might happen in the future. So we're here today to mark the 50th anniversary of this splendid opening ceremony that took place in this same building. We tried to find out if this was exactly the same lecture theatre, and I think it probably is. It's been redecorated and fortunately is dragged into the 21st century with some technology, but I think we're here. Exactly on the 16th of October 1973. The Institute's legislation was actually proclaimed about a year earlier, in November 1972. An acting director, Judge James Muirhead, who's seated on the very far left of the picture here, arrived at the Institute to start work on the 1st of February 1973, so sometime later. The Attorney General at the time was Lionel Murphy QC, and he's seated behind the flower arrangement, but we'll come back to him shortly. He opened the Institute's premises before an audience about the same as this size, about 400 people, that included representatives from Commonwealth, state agencies. Territories didn't get a great mention at that point in time, but certainly the states were represented. There were overseas guests, and in particular, sitting next to the lectern is Mr. Minoru Shikita from UNIFE, who's the equivalent of the AIC's institute based in Tokyo. And interesting, last week we sent him a copy of the little book, and I got a thank you letter from UNIFE saying that they were very pleased to see Australia celebrating its 50th anniversary, and they'd circulated the book around their research staff. I'd had some correspondence with UNIFE during the process of the research for this, and they were very impressed that the Institute had kept so many documents and records of its history, and they were a bit concerned about their own level of documentation and archival work in Tokyo. So I think part of the reason why we can do a history like this is the splendid record keeping that the Institute's kept over the years, partly due to the former librarian John Myrtle, who's sitting in the front here. So there were a lot of these officials at the original opening, one of whom, Professor Richard Harding, was at the opening ceremony, and it's splendid to see him here today, and we'll hear some more from Richard shortly. The chairman of the board, Frank Marnie, was overseas at the time. There was a lot of international travel at that time, and he wasn't able to be at the opening, but his deputy, Peter Loof, from the Attorney General's Department, gave the opening address, and he was followed by the chairman, the chairman of the board, Justice John McClements from the New South Wales Supreme Court, who's at the lectern here and was halfway through what was a very long and detailed speech for which he was renowned. So fortunately, through the splendid work of the Institute's archivists, we have an audio recording of the entire opening ceremony in 1973, and I'm going to bore you with some extracts from that. Fortunately, I'm not going to play all of Judge McClement's opening address. Now, when I was talking about doing a talk like this with my partner, Melinda Mockridge, who's sitting here in the front row, she reminded me of Charles Dickens' Christmas Carol, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And so I thought we'd start by hearing about the ghosts of the Institute past. So Peter Loof, up here on the left, was chairman of the Institute's board between 1979 and 1982. And he played a really central role in developing the legislation of the Institute, shepherding it through the department and also making sure that it got a reasonably easy passage through Parliament. Peter attended the 40th anniversary of the Institute in 2012, but sadly died 4 years later. And I hope there's no correlation between attending an anniversary and imminent demise. The Attorney General, Lionel Murphy, then gave the keynote address. Actually, before I go on, I might just play a little bit of Peter's address, just to give you a flavour of what his view was about setting up the Institute.
Like the Sydney Opera House, the Institute has been open for business a little in advance of the official opening ceremony, and there are perhaps some other similarities between the two institutions. Each has been futurist in conception. Both have been difficult of construction. The Institute itself has not been as costly a venture, but the phenomenon of crime, which is its target, is indeed a drainer on the economy of proportions not generally appreciated. But here, alas, the similarity ceases. The one institution exalts the arts and human achievements. The other is concerned with social deviance and with human tragedy.
So Lionel Murphy then gave the opening keynote address, and he opened with some very prescient warnings about what was going to happen in the future and advice for the then Labor government that was in power, and similarly for governments to follow. And this is the end of Lionel's address.
Professor Radzinovich was out here a few weeks ago in connection with the seminar in Melbourne, and I spoke with him for a little while in that part of the week when he was in Sydney, and he expressed his high hopes for the success of the Institute, and it's indicated its potentiality. He had the belief that this institute could be a great institute to make a valuable international contribution. But he sounded a warning, and he said it was possible that if the Institute did not get the support of the governments, if it did not enrol in its ranks the people who ought to be enrolled, if it did not act with vigour and understand the important contribution it could make, well, then it would not succeed. And if it did not succeed, all of those associated with it, those in government, those in the various ways who associated with it, would deserve the condemnation of the world, because here is an institute which is supported by all governments, given a great charter. It is entitled to financial support, it's entitled to moral support, not only of governments but of all the workers in criminology. It's entitled to all the support of you all, and I'm sure that it will get that support. It will be a great institute, It'll be an institute of which Australia can be proud, and a just pride in a body that is able to help in solving one of the major problems of mankind.
So Leon Radzinovich, who's in the bottom right-hand corner there, had just retired as director of the Cambridge Institute of Criminology, which was set up about 10 years earlier. And before the AIC board first met, the federal government had asked Sir Leon to come out to Australia to give some advice on setting up the institute. He arrived in May 1973 and spoke at length with Jim Muirhead, Peter Loof, Lionel Murphy and various others, and travelled both to Sydney and Melbourne to discuss the institute and the way it would operate. I should add that Sir Leon was not very fond of air travel. In 1973, you can imagine what the planes were like. Jim Muirhead had accompanied him on a trip down to Melbourne, and while they were waiting for takeoff at Tullamarine Airport, Jim recalled that, and I'll quote here, Sir Leon persistently requested a glass of champagne and refused to fasten his seatbelt, requiring the captain to come over and persuade him to do so before the plane could take off. Here's a short extract of Sir Leon with his splendid Polish accent.
As you know, I was the first head of the United Nations section to deal with problems of crime. I was the first chairman of the Criminological Council of the Council of Europe. And there were many other activities, international activities that I have undertaken because I felt that they extend the dimension of criminology.
So Sir Leon was what we can call a socially liberal, took a socially liberal approach to humanitarian reform of the criminal justice system, underpinned by the empirical findings of social scientific research. So he was really setting the basis for the way the Institute's operated over the last 50 years. So giving policy advice based on good data and evidence. He was heavily involved in criminology internationally, and as he recalled in his interview, we've just heard, he travelled widely and was involved in many institutions promoting criminology at the time. He attended the first 4 of the United Nations congresses, which were massive meetings held every 5 years. So between 1955, year of my birth, and 1970, he attended each of those congresses. And at those places, there was a lot of discussion that took place about setting up institutes around the world like the AIC and indeed the AIC itself. At the first Congress in Geneva, which we have a picture of here, courtesy of Judge Barry's family from their archives, Australia was represented by Professor Norval Morris, who's sitting in the front row on the right-hand side there. He was at the time at the University of Melbourne. Sir John Barry seated next to him with the translation headphones on from the Supreme Court of Victoria, and Harold Vagg, who was Deputy Controller of Prisons in New South Wales, who's sitting next to Sir John. Norval Morris recalled this event and some of the others in an interview he gave with Michael Tonry for the American Society of Criminology's archive project in 1996.
And during the period in Australia, I'd also got interested in human rights matters and social defence matters with the United Nations, and made quite a few trips to Southeast Asia and to Europe, often with an Australian judge, Sir John Barry.
And this brings us to Barry's involvement in setting up the Institute. Barry was a Justice of the Supreme Court of Victoria. He's chairman of the Victorian Parole Board and also of the Department of Criminology at the University of Melbourne. For a judge, he had a very keen interest in social justice and criminology and was a regular commentator on law reform at the time. He'd also published 2 well-respected historical volumes on on crime and justice in colonial times in Australia, which are well worth a read if you can get access to them. Now, in the foreword to the book, former Justice Michael Kirby said of Barry as follows. He said, "Barry wanted an institution that would pursue a radical program, conducting deep and broad research into the causes and consequences of crime, the ways to address the topics empirically, to secure proper scholarly assistance with the establishment of institutional cooperation among traditional adversaries and competitors, including politicians, departmental officers and independent scholars." Barry went to the first two UN congresses, and you can see the one in 1955 was in Geneva, the next one in London, one after that in Stockholm, and the one in 1970 in Tokyo. And at these four first congresses were the places where the nuts and bolts of the Institute were mapped out. Justice McClements attended the London Congress in 1960 with Barry, and they stood around in the corridors, and those of you who've been to these congresses will know that there's plenty of time to stand around in corridors, and planned what the Institute would be like. So McClements explained Barry's involvement in this as follows.
As long ago as 1960, to my knowledge, it may have been earlier, but I know in 1960 in London he had this idea and he was already campaigning. I heard him speak at public meetings on it, meetings of the Australian Prison Aftercare Council. I know that he approached various ministers and he was campaigning to have this institute established. He already had done a great amount towards the founding of the department in Melbourne, but that didn't go far enough because he had the idea of the one total Australia. And from the early 1960 onwards, he campaigned single-handed against apathy and lack of interest to bring this institution into existence.
So, taking you back to the 1960s, when this was all being mapped out, during that time there were a whole range of criminal justice and research problems that were present that the Institute was arguably set up to try and solve, at least some of them. These included these elements. Firstly, there was a general lack of availability of good crime statistics, and also lack of uniformity amongst crime statistics over different jurisdictions, both within Australia and also internationally. Very poor level of training available for criminal justice personnel. Police and also corrections were two major areas of concern. Lack of collaboration amongst criminal justice stakeholders internationally. Very little evaluation of crime prevention measures. There was still a need for reform of sentencing and correctional practices, and we can recall that capital punishment was still federally available until 1973 and in Australia until 1985. The 1960s also, interestingly, saw an increase in organised crime, particularly some of the mafia infiltration of rural regions in Victoria and New South Wales. Technologically enabled crime was starting. You might not think that was the case in the 60s, but telephone fraud using the infamous black box was starting to take place, and these were new crime problems that needed some work. Anthony Morgan will tell us more about that later. And there was an absence of government-funded research for criminology and also for research in Australia more widely, and that was a major concern that needed resolution. So hopefully the Institute was able to fix some of those problems. So the agreed model that was set up was as follows. Barry, Loof and the others drafted legislation in 1970, and it comprised three main elements. The first was having a board composed of 6 members 3 appointed from the Attorney General's Department, and 3 state representatives chosen from amongst the Criminology Research Council. This second element was a research council that was set up with 7 members, 1 Commonwealth appointee and 1 from each of the 6 states. Territories weren't included at this point. The council was empowered principally to administer a research fund that was the third component, which was given an initial grant of $100,000, $50,000 from the Commonwealth and $50,000 shared amongst the other states. So this was seen as a demonstration of what was called at the time cooperative federalism. So you had representation and funding from both the Commonwealth and the states, ideally with bipartisan support. And an example of the bipartisanship at the time was that the 1971 Act was introduced by the coalition government, the Gorton government, but Whitlam government, the Labor government, took over the initial implementation of that. If you look over the 5 decades, the Liberal National Coalition was in government on 4 occasions, with 6 different prime ministers and 12 ministers responsible for the AIC. Interestingly, over the 5 decades, the Labor government was also in government on 4 occasions. It had 6 different prime ministers and 11 ministers responsible for the AIC. So the Institute's experienced a lot of interactions between these different governments that were in power sequentially at different times over the whole 5 decades. It had to work equally as well with both political persuasions of government over time. So once you had the legislation, you had to set up this new institution, and there were a whole range of different and sometimes very complex questions that had to be resolved about how the institute was going to operate. The first one was where it should be located, and in the 1960s the UN had come up with this idea of trying to establish crime and justice research institutes in many continents, all of the continents hopefully, and many places around the world. The first UN organisation was set up in Tokyo, as I mentioned, in 1962 under the directorship of Norval Morris. There was a long and complex battle about who the director would be there, and you can read about that in the book at your leisure. Discussions then took place about setting up another research institute in Australia or New Zealand. At the time, New Zealand already had quite a good crime and justice research capability in its Department of Justice, and so it was decided that Australia would be a better place to set up this institute than New Zealand, although New Zealand would be able to use its facilities and training activities when needed. Questions then arose about where in Australia the new institute should be located, in a capital city perhaps, or a regional centre. And Albury-Wodonga was mentioned a number of times as a potential place, but it was just considered to be too remote and too difficult to have liaison with people. So a central base in Canberra was thought the ideal place, and particularly as the Commonwealth was providing at least half the funding. Next, our debate arose about whether it would be set up in a government department or maybe in a university, like was the case in Cambridge. The universities of Melbourne, Monash and ANU were all considered as potential places for the institute, but eventually it was decided to create an independent statutory authority set up in the Attorney General's portfolio. And it started in Attorney General's and moved through various differently named portfolios, and has now returned to the Attorney General's portfolio. The question also arose about the physical location of the office, and there was some thought that a nice expensive office in the Parliamentary Triangle would be suitable, but others thought it would be better to go to a cheaper location, perhaps in Tuggeranong. In the event, and this is the picture we have in more recent times, but it was decided to put the Institute in Ethos House in Civic, which Dennis Challenger, who was one of the first grant recipients, came up and visited Jim Muirhead in Ethos House and described it as a most unprepossessing office building. When Sir Leon Radzinovich provided his advice to Jim Muirhead in 1973 about setting up the Institute, he said, and I won't use Sir Leon's accent, but he said the location of the Institute somewhere in the periphery of Canberra would not do, nor would temporary buildings kept for too long in the hope that something more important would come along be a satisfactory solution. If the real intention is to build up in Australia an institute of an exceptional stature, then much greater priority should be assigned to its building right now. And Sir Leon, you'll remember, was hanging around in the United Nations environment where there was very elaborate facilities, international translation facilities in multiple languages, accommodation provided in these buildings, and he thought this was the sort of thing that Australia should have. So after a short stay mercifully short stay in Ethos House, it was decided to move to Colby Court in a light industrial area in Phillip in the ACT. And despite the fact that this was meant to be a temporary location, they stayed there for 17 years. That's Colby Court in the top left-hand corner there. And that's one of the training programs at Colby Court in the very earliest years. The building was pretty unsuitable, and after Attorney General Lionel Bowen fell down the rickety staircase in 1989, the director at the time, Duncan Chappell, was able to secure a much more salubrious building in Marcus Clark Street in Civic, and this is the one with the round building with the branding. Unfortunately, the rental for this was more than a third of the Institute's appropriation at the time, and the name tag alone on the front of the building cost $30,000 a year to rent. And so there was a good deal of criticism of allocating this amount of money to accommodation alone. And so it was decided to move again to the suburbs, this time to Griffith, in the former public library building in Leichhardt Street. And the Institute remained there for 20 years, which was largely my place to which I was sentenced. After a few attempts at renovations in that building and following the machinery of government change in 2015, the Institute moved to its current location in the Australian Crime Commission, now Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission's building in National Circuit, where it occupies some ground floor space for its library and for desk working space for staff when they're not working from home. So what was the Institute set up to do? In its legislation there were 6 main areas of work. Obviously to conduct criminological research, although there were heated debates over what criminological meant. Communicating research findings to the Commonwealth and the states. That was easy in Canberra, but there was a lot of travel required to liaise with the other states and later territories. It was required to conduct seminars and courses of training, support the Research Council in its funding program and give advice on the projects that were funded, and importantly, give advice and listen to the wording very carefully in relation to the compilation of crime statistics. And this led to a heated discussion about the relationship between the Institute's role in dealing with statistics and the Australian Bureau of Statistics' role. So the Institute at this point was given jurisdiction over providing advice on collecting statistics, not actually gathering them. And finally, to publish research, and this actually led to the setting up of a publishing house in the Colby Court building with printers and all of the paraphernalia needed to publish reports and other publications. All of these activities had to be approved by the board, so whatever the Institute did had to have board approval, and over time the scope and implementation of each of those areas changed as board members changed, as directors changed, and as heads of departments also changed. Although the original structures remain much the same, there have been many changes to the legislation, policies and procedures over the years. Over the 5 decades, there have been actually a dozen or more inquiries into the Institute's activities, instigated by both coalition and also Labor governments. And they've sought procedural reforms, others tried to reduce funding, others sought to abolish the Institute or to amalgamate it with other government entities. Some of those inquiries succeeded in part, others failed. There were, however, some pretty major reforms that took place, and I'll just mention these briefly. In 1986, the Northern Territory was added to the Criminology Research Council. At that time, also in legislation, the director became a board member. The AIC was authorised to bid for external funding. So as the appropriation declined, the Institute really needed more money coming in, and so they were permitted to seek funding from other organisations. It was given a legislative power to do international work and training activities. So this solved some of the problems about the travel issue. People thought that directors and others were travelling too much, and so this was meant to put a dampener on that problem. And it was also, and largely due to Richard Harding's work with Peter Loof, who was given specific jurisdiction over statistical data collection, which required quite a lot of work with the Bureau of Statistics. 2003, the ACT was added as a council member, and so Northern Territory and ACT now contribute to the funding package. 2011 saw probably the greatest reform, and this was when legislation was introduced which merged the AIC entity with the Criminology Research Council, the funding entity. So they were created into one body, the Australian Institute of Criminology, and the two boards, the board and the CRC, as separate governing bodies, were merged into one and replaced with an advisory council that was set up to set priorities for research and continue to award the research grants. Ministerial control over the Institute's work increased at that time as well, and the director was given more responsibility for determining the Institute's daily work. Brendan O'Connor, in the centre of this picture here, was the minister at the time. Richard Fox, on the right, was the chair of the AIC's board, and Laurie Glanfield was the last chair of the Criminology Research Council. So they ceased their positions at that time, being replaced by Penny Armitage from Victoria, who was the chair of the new advisory council. Now in 2015, following a plan to merge the Institute with the Australian Crime Commission, which would have required legislative changes, the government instead implemented a machinery of government change that transferred the employment of staff to the ACC and later ACIC, and the introduction of a shared services arrangement, so all of the administration was shared with the ACC, and also sharing accommodation. So it was decided that it was cheaper to move in with the Crime Commission in its own building in National Circuit now. So a lot of changes, and I shouldn't give the impression that this was specifically targeted at the Institute. These are the sort of things that happen to a lot of similar entities in the Commonwealth. Think of the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, Institute of Family Studies, the Australian Law Reform Commission. They all had these sort of pressures relating to their activities. So it was in 1972 that the Institute opened for business. We had a staff of 13, there on the left there with Judge Muirhead sitting in the middle. 8 of these were women, and these largely comprised the typing pool in the pre-digital age. They also had women as librarians and admin assistants, and a small group of men who were largely the finance officers, the researchers and the acting director. 50 years later, and we have most of you here today in the flesh, these are the current researchers. Again, we've still got a female library contingent, but now there are many more women in research roles at all levels, although at the moment not at director or deputy director level. In the mid-2000s, the Institute had its first and only female director, Dr. Toni Mackay, who's here today, and women were also in charge of the major divisions in the Institute, so research, information services and communications. Since then, those senior management positions have again largely been occupied by men. There have, however, been a number of very highly qualified and forthright women who've worked at the Institute over the years, and I'll mention some of them. Mary Daunton-Fear from South Australia, who was one of the inaugural legal researchers. Jocelyn Scutt in the 1970s, who was a prominent feminist legal academic. Kayleen Hazelhurst, who undertook the Institute's early research into Indigenous issues. Heather Strang in the 1980s, who later became a famous researcher in restorative justice. Patricia Eastdale in the 1990s, and far too many to name all of them since then. When I interviewed Peter Grabowski for this history work, Peter said as follows. He said, most of the board members of the Institute in those days were gentlemen in their late to middle age who were really not attuned to issues affecting women. Jocelyn Scutt, who's here, Peter said, Jocelyn Scutt's work on issues of sexual assault and domestic violence placed these issues on the agenda and helped to raise everybody's consciousness. And we'll hear more about the Institute's work in this area from Dr. Hayley Boxall shortly. So, what can we say then about what the Institute's achieved over the 50 years? Now, creating a list of achievements of an organisation carries with it the risk of compromising the objectivity in an institutional history, and my publisher warned me about this when I first proposed the idea of doing this. The American academic Professor Franklin Zimring noted this when he was reviewing the work of the Centre for Studies of Criminal Justice at the University of Chicago in 1984. And he wrote, this is a great warning to myself, library shelves are already groaning under the weight of volumes of self-congratulation and institutional boosterism that have not left the world of ideas a better place. He said, to organise a volume round the contribution of a single research institution is often parochial and occasionally unseemly. So at the risk of being unseemly, here's my list of what I think the institution's main contributions have been. Firstly, in terms of personnel, the Institute's employed over 1,000 research staff over the 5 decades, and this has really contributed to the development of the criminological research workforce that we have today in Australia. It's published, as Rick said, over 1,700 or 1,800 reports and articles, which is generally much more than the annual output of a university academic department. It's provided funding of over $12.6 million from the Research Council for Academic Research. The library currently has a collection of almost 100,000 items worth over $1 million, and it's recognised as one of the world's best criminological collections. It's delivered training programs across Australia and the Pacific regions, not only for criminology justice staff but also criminology researchers. And importantly, it's been involved in some really forthright and important agenda setting. In the 1990s, it produced a large volume called Violence in Australia, which was really a compilation of everything we know about violence and its prevention in Australia. And this was an extremely timely work that was able to be used following the the mass shootings in Melbourne, and later led to the work of the gun buyback. And Peter Grabowski and Duncan Chappell were both heavily involved in running the National Committee on Violence at the time. The Institute did work on bushfire arson, organised crime, cybercrime, money laundering, and a whole range of national crime prevention monitoring strategies. And these were things that no one was really working on at the time. University academics really hadn't got into a lot of those areas, and so this was the only place that you could go to find out really hard empirical information about these topics. And it also provided a lot of expertise internationally and represented Australia in many international fora. So if another country wanted to know what the situation was in Australia about a particular crime problem, the Institute was the place to go to. Professor Ernesto Savona, who's director of transcrime in Milan, wrote in support of the Institute in 2016 as follows. He said, "Over the years, the Australian Institute of Criminology's research has been of great significance and used by organisations regularly. It's also played an important role in one of the United Nations research bodies. Since the Institute was established, it's provided important, rigorous criminological research that has assisted organisations throughout the world." Now, in light of events over the weekend, I thought it would be important to mention something about the Institute's work on Indigenous justice over the 5 decades. Since it was established, the Institute has had a keen interest in crime and justice questions affecting Indigenous Australians. Both Jim Muirhead and Bill Clifford, the first acting and first director, had an enduring interest in Aboriginal disadvantage and imprisonment. And of course, Judge Muirhead was the first commissioner for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, with David Biles as the Commission's Director of Research on secondment from the Institute. Following the Royal Commission, the Institute was given responsibility for collecting data on deaths in custody, and this continues to present, as we'll hear from Samantha Bricknell shortly. The Research Councils provided funding for over 30 different research projects on Indigenous topics, and interestingly, in the very first round of grant applications, there was one in 1973 entitled "The Aboriginal and Officialdom, a Gap to be Bridged, How Wide the Gap, Where the Bridge." When Richard Harding arrived as director in 1984, he increased the focus on Aboriginal justice by appointing David Biles as Deputy Director and Kayleen Hazelhurst to conduct research on Aboriginal justice topics. John Walker, who's here today, was asked to undertake the work on deaths in custody and overrepresentation of Aboriginal offenders initially. And others at the Institute, such as David McDonald, Vicky Dalton, Judy Putt, also focused on this area of research. In 1992, the Institute's first round of crime prevention awards was announced by Prime Minister Paul Keating, and the 31st annual awards ceremony will take place after this conference today. One of the first successful awards, worth $40,000, went to the Julalakari Night Patrol in the Northern Territory, which examined violence associated with alcohol consumption amongst Aborigines. Subsequent directors continued to promote Indigenous justice research. Director Adam Graycar, who's here with us, supported the librarian Janet Smith's work in establishing the Indigenous Justice Clearinghouse in 2007. Director Adam Thomason promoted new research in the area of sexual abuse of Aboriginal children in the Northern Territory. And most recently, in 2021, the Institute's increased its emphasis on Indigenous research with the creation of an Indigenous Justice Research Program with funding of over $1 million for new research projects. Now, in terms of impact, I guess the Institute hasn't solved the problems of Indigenous disadvantage, overrepresentation or deaths in custody. But through its research, we now have substantial data on the nature and extent of these problems that simply would not have existed without the Institute's research programs. So this provides a fundamental basis for governments to then make policy decisions with some actual hard data on what's going on. If you look at the Institute's library catalogue today, there are over 6,000 items dealing with Indigenous justice topics. From my 3-year exploration of the Institute's work, I've identified what might be called the Institute's formula for success. And I've examined these elements in detail in the book, but just briefly, they're as follows. Firstly, and probably most importantly, is this idea of cooperative federalism. And Jim Muirhead explained this at the opening of the Institute in 1973. And I've got an extract of his words here.
Perhaps most of you know this, but it is worth emphasising that we are a national body formed and managed by the states and the Australian government, the product of what was once described by the Honourable the Prime Minister as an exercise in cooperative federalism. In the field of crime control, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a concept one can afford to avoid. And there are no differences of opinion as to the critical necessity of crime control, as to the necessity of obtaining not only justice, but also security for each and every Australian. And just as traditional parochialism has not inhibited the creation of this National Institute, so also, I believe, must national parochialism bow to the spectre of international crime and lawlessness.
It's critical to maintain good relationships between all the Institute's stakeholders, and these include people in government, in the private sector, within Australia and also internationally. Frugality is critical. The Institute has had to manage its ever-decreasing budget very carefully and avoid extravagance or perceptions of waste. The Institute's had to maintain a happy and productive workforce that involves efficient recruitment, which was often difficult, getting people to come to Canberra, and also retention of staff at all levels of seniority. In terms of visibility, it's been necessary to maintain a profile locally and internationally, but not engage with media in a sensationalist way. It's been essential to ensure that standards are maintained in terms of producing ethical and quality research, such as through using ethics committees and peer review processes on publications. The Institute has sought to be innovative and keep one step ahead of the pack in working on the most relevant, innovative and important topics, and the determination of those elements was largely the responsibility of the board and also the directors. And interestingly, the staff itself. A lot of the work that the Institute did, in particularly boutique areas, was because there were people working on the research staff who had an interest in those areas. I'm guilty as anyone in that area in having an interest in economic crime, but other people took an interest in bushfire arson, sexual violence, very obscure topics sometimes, such as fisheries crime. So the expertise of staff was really important to recognise. And finally, it's been essential to maintain its independence in the advice it gives to governments. And the late Professor Gilbert Geis from the University of California in Irvine explained this in 1994 following one of the Institute's reviews, the Tanzer Review. And Gil wrote in his own inimitable style, he said, "The AIC provides a quintessential illustration of a government agency structurally and functionally caught between a rock and a hard place. The AIC is funded by the Commonwealth Government and operates under the aegis of the Attorney-General. It's charged with conducting research on the socially and politically sensitive topics of crime and justice research. If the results of this research produce distress and discontent in those who fund its fate, they can either grin and bear it with as much grace as they can muster, or they can retaliate. The history of the AIC demonstrates the constant tension that this arrangement has created. And now, returning to the Christmas Carol, we're going to hear from some of the ghosts of the Institute present. These are some observations that some of the people I interviewed about their thoughts about the Institute and how it's going at the moment. Fiona Dowsley is the Advisory Council member for Victoria at the moment and Chief Statistician in the Crime Statistics Agency in Victoria. And in her interview with me, she said, "The AIC needs to work in an independent, truth-to-power, frank and fearless kind of way, but this will require a certain force of will from the people leading the organisation to ensure that independence remains and the work is still respected." In his speech on leaving as chair of the AIC's board in 2011, Professor Richard Fox gave the following warning. Richard said, "Beware, the Institute will never be able to escape the tension of a potentially fickle relationship with the media, with sources of funding, and with government when undertaking policy-oriented research. Its independence of its research and its willingness to fight to maintain the environment in which it can undertake its work are widely disseminate its findings." And finally, in his interview with me, Grant Wardlaw, who was an AIC researcher between 1976 and 1991, an acting director in 1994, and also a member of the Tanser Review Committee at that time, concluded with the observation that the Institute was a bold and very positive initiative when it was first proposed, and all organisations, particularly where a lot of time it appears to be a contested ground, are going to have difficulties. If you look at the total output of the Institute over the years, it's made a substantial contribution. And finally, the ghost of the Institute future. Jim Muirhead, back in 1973, concluded his address by offering his own observations on the Institute's future, and I thought I'd play this for you to consider some wise and very relevant thoughts.
As for the future, I say just a few words. It is essential, in my view, that this institute should have its own building and accommodation facilities to simplify our future training programs. We will never, I trust, become by modern standards a large concern. We have, of course, wide functions in large areas of work, but there is, I believe, a need to retain simplicity and flexibility for careful planning and intelligent use of our own and outside resources. We must not reach the stage where too great a percentage of our budget is utilised by people looking after other people on the same staff, and we must seek to develop simple administrative techniques. In our staff, we must look for quality rather than quantity. We must utilise the experience of people overseas and learn from them. I'm very aware of the fact that to date Australia has not proved a very encouraging venue for those who have interested themselves in criminology, and we have lost so many good workers to other countries, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom. It is most important that we close the gap between those who work in exploratory and academic fields and those who work in the day-to-day administration of criminal justice. We have much to learn, I think, from each other, and I hope that the establishment of this institute will stimulate research and interest in universities and elsewhere, and may aid the growth and revitalise sensibly structured courses in criminology, penology and associated studies or sciences. Furthermore, despite the availability of such people to implement modern approaches, there is, I'm convinced, a critical need in Australia for trained people in the areas of social science and social welfare. People who are qualified and ready to get out and work amongst the people, not only in our major cities, but in our more northern regions such as the Northern Territory. Ladies and gentlemen, we will in the future rely completely on the cooperation of the states, and in fields of national importance, be it seeking uniformity of crime statistics, combating delinquency, or examining the effectiveness of penal methods, we must work in harmony with the states, their instrumentalities and universities. In our association with the Criminology Research Council, which by funding encourages research elsewhere in this country, through our library and information facilities, we will, I hope, become a centre which will prove of continuing value to those who in their daily work attempt to maintain our domestic security. We will of course not eradicate crime, we will not come up with all the answers, but given support I believe this institute will soon justify the hopes of those who in past years have repeatedly urged a more energetic and a more coordinated approach to our common problems.
Thank you, Jim. And finally, this is just a reminder that the Institute's achievements are due to a lot of people. And they include not only board members, directors and senior managers, but researchers at all levels of seniority, librarians, accountants, communications specialists, IT professionals, maintenance and security staff, and many interns who come to the Institute, visiting academics and, dare I say it, consultants. Institute, I did a splendid project with PricewaterhouseCoopers at one point. Seriously, it was nice to work with them. They were very professional. Although I've not been able to acknowledge all of the people in this talk or indeed in the book, they all deserve their really share of recognition and thanks for keeping the Institute afloat. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Russell. Now, I'm going to eat into your morning tea very slightly by now having the book launch for the book that Russell has been speaking about. So it's my great pleasure to welcome our former director, Richard Harding, to come up and say a few words about the book. Can you please welcome Richard?
Thank you very much. I'm very honoured to have been asked to launch this book. I wasn't quite prepared for the degree of nostalgia that it has induced. Reading it, there are all these familiar names, but when I actually hear the voices of good friends like Jim Muirhead and Lionel Murphy at key moments in the history of the Institute, it is a little confronting. However, let me get straight to the essence of this book and what there is to say about it. It's comprehensive as to the history of the Australian Institute of Criminology, and you've heard that already from Russell. The thematic structure is cohesive and cogent. The references to other international models of public sector criminological activity are enlightening and relevant. It is enhanced by photographic material, and the various timeline charts of personnel, legal developments and political changes are hugely informative. The narrative, and this is where Russell finished, is very much people-focused, as it has to be. It is absolutely appropriate that this should be the case, as all institutions change and develop through individual efforts and team efforts led by individuals. I said this book was excellent. Let me go further and say to Dr. Russell Smith that it is outstanding. Before officially launching it, however, let me reflect upon some themes and conclusions. Russell identifies that from the outset there seems to have been some tension between prioritising matters of concern to the Commonwealth and those of particular relevance to the states and territories. The book teases out how the balance has shifted back and forth over time and how that ambivalence has affected Commonwealth attitudes towards resources and funding. For my own part, I've never remotely understood why there should be any divergence of view on this. If you address a crime problem in one state, you are helping Australia. And I'm delighted to see that the recent trends and issues, I looked at number 670, for example, which relates to domestic violence by members of outlaw motorcycle gangs in New South Wales, absolutely reflects this. There are outlaw motorcycle gangs in all states. And so the findings for 670 are of as much relevance to Western Australia and South Australia and so on as they are to New South Wales. So I've never understood this supposed conflict, and I was delighted, having been handed this book today, Crime and Justice Research 2023, to see that actually the list of contents of current research absolutely indicates that this supposed divergence between what is of national Commonwealth interest and what is of state interest only has apparently been swept aside. That's a good thing. More generally, on the issue of funding and resources, Dr. Smith argues convincingly that the Commonwealth wants more and more for less and less. The efforts of dedicated staff over decades, punching above their weight, as a whole chapter describes, has enabled the Commonwealth Government to get away with not facing up to this reality. This cannot go on indefinitely. So the question is asked by Russell, what will a future model of Australian public sector criminological research look like? A question, a sub-question, an important sub-question that he then poses is whether it might involve private sector consultants. Despite what he said about his own successful foray with PwC 20 years ago, he is sceptical whether private sector consultancy work would in fact be effective. He asks, do private consultants possess the skills base, and how expensive would it be? I would add a third question. Would there be intellectual rigour and integrity in the manner in which any such research was carried out and its results promulgated? I think we now know, if we didn't do so previously, the answer to those questions. Putting their hands up for private sector consulting money would be the big four, including PricewaterhouseCoopers. In 2021-22, fees totaling $1.46 billion were paid to these firms. Last year, Labour had managed to cut it back to $813 million, still a huge amount. PwC received $212 million. Anyone who has ever read any reports from these kinds of consultancy agencies would know how formulaic they typically are, oozing, one might almost say suppurating, with management speak jargon. How much preferable it would be to divert some of those notional funds, a tiny amount such as $5 million a year, to an agency that possesses subject matter skills, is connected to practitioners and policymakers, and habitually carries out its work with intellectual rigour and moral integrity. I am, of course, referring to the Institute. The revitalised Australian Institute of Criminology would provide a huge return on investment. In that regard, the book documents the many areas, and Russell has already documented the many areas in which the Australian Institute of Criminology has been ahead of the game in its research programs. For example, cybercrime and human trafficking. the author also emphasises the enormous value of the various monitoring programs, such as the National Homicide Monitoring Programme, the National Deaths in Custody Programme, the National Cybercrime Monitoring Programme, most of which were created as a consequence or are closely related to Institute research. The book also discusses at length, and Russell touched upon this, the moves in 2015 that resulted in the Institute becoming administratively, though not legislatively, linked to the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission. Although he is careful not to overstate his points and puts on the record some practical benefits of this arrangement, I think it's fair to say that Russell Smith considers it to be an uncomfortable arrangement. He states, "The unintended consequence of the partial merger between the AIC and the ACIC and the sharing of premises has coloured the Institute's research focus and arguably detracted from its role as an independent government research body." Later, he develops these points. Tellingly, it is suggested that the earlier strength of the Institute was that it was an, quotes, outward-facing institution, in regular touch with academia, journalists, state government agencies, and so on. Since the partial merger, that crucial characteristic has inevitably been constrained. Without being so brash as to say so explicitly, I think it is fair to say that the author believes that the arrangement should be reversed. The Institute should revert to being a standalone agency with its own administrative staff, dedicated premises, governance structure, and research priorities. His conclusion is that the Australian Institute of Criminology has provided a substantial evidence base that has informed policy and legislative reform not only throughout Australia but internationally, and will, with good management and appropriate funding, continue to do so in the years ahead. Let me conclude by saying that I think the current Commonwealth Government has a challenge that it would be relatively straightforward to meet, restoring the Australian Institute of Criminology to full effectiveness and efficiency. This excellent book is, in a sense, a handbook on what the issues are and how to resolve them. It's a simple thing to do administratively, without legislative or parliamentary complications. The benefits that would be reaped would be immediate, tangible, and ongoing. I hope, therefore, that some kind of a briefing note and complimentary copies of the book have been sent to the Attorney General and his senior advisors. I now have pleasure in officially launching public sector criminological research, the Australian Institute of Criminology 1972 to 2022, and again congratulating Dr. Russell Smith for his fine achievement.
I want to thank Richard for his exceedingly kind words and also perceptive observations about the book. I'm delighted to see that you spotted my subtle suggestion that funding should increase for the Institute and also that it should be reverted to an independent agency where I think it would flourish probably more easily than in the present case. Just a brief note of thanks to all of the people who contributed. They're all listed in the book, but I interviewed a lot of people. I corresponded with many people overseas who provided their own reminiscences and tracked down people that were hard to find. I was able to make use of the reminiscences of a lot of deceased people. Some of the key people in the history of the Institute are no longer with us, but they were the sort of people that put all of their thoughts down in writing, published books, articles, gave speeches, and I had access to all that material. So even though they weren't alive and with us today, they provided a very great body of information. I'd like to also thank the Australian Institute of Criminology itself, the AIC and the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission, who provided access to all of this material. Working with a government department like this is sometimes difficult, particularly with sensitive material that I was able to have access to. So they were very forthright and also gracious in allowing me access to the material. I'd like to thank my partner Melinda Mockridge, who allowed me to occupy a lot of my retirement days trawling through papers and books and listening to boring speeches. So thank you for that. And as a professional historian herself, she knows some of the pleasure and also the pain associated with doing this sort of work. Like other historical works, my book sets the scene for a much more intensive research on specific issues that I've uncovered. I've just touched the surface on a lot of these topics. I hope to explore some of them myself, but I do hope others, particularly those younger than myself, will also take up the challenge and continue working in this area. Thank you. Good.